How I Got Free Water for a Year by Playing the Long Game Hey Reddit. I'm Rachel, 35F, and I work in residential real estate construction. This story is about how two sexist water department workers learned the hard way not to underestimate a stupid woman who knows her stuff. Buckle up, because this tale of petty revenge was a year in the making. It all started when my now ex-husband and I bought his childhood home from his parents. They'd had it built back in the 50s, and like any house pushing 70 years old, it came with its share of quirks and issues. The biggest headache? A missing water shutoff valve that had been driving my father-in-law crazy for decades. See? Most houses have this thing called a buffalo box. It's basically the main water shutoff valve that connects to the city's water supply. It's usually located near the street, and it's essential if you need to do any major plumbing work. My father-in-law had wanted to install an interior shutoff valve in the utility room for years, but every plumber who looked at the job quoted him an astronomical price because they couldn't find the buffalo box. Without access to the main shutoff, they'd have to use this complicated pipe freezing process to stop the water flow temporarily. The cost was ridiculous, so the project kept getting pushed back, year after year. My father-in-law would bring it up at every family gathering, detailing his failed attempts to locate the mysterious buffalo box. You could see the frustration in his eyes. This house he'd built and maintained for decades had this one stubborn problem he just couldn't solve. When we took over the house, I decided it was time to tackle this issue head-on. I knew from my background in construction that the buffalo box was the city's responsibility, not the homeowners. Simple enough, right? Just call the water department, have them locate their equipment, and get this sorted out once and for all. The water department sent out 2 workers, and this is where things got interesting. I explained the situation, watching as they half-heartedly wandered around our front yard for maybe 5 minutes. Their body language screamed, "We don't want to be here," from the moment they arrived. Finally, one of them turned to me with this condescending smirk and said, "Ma'am, if we can't find your buffalo box, that's your problem. You'll need to hire a plumber to dig up your yard, sidewalk, and the city easement to locate it." I kept my cool and explained that actually, the buffalo box was city property and their responsibility to maintain. The moment I started citing specific regulations, their attitudes shifted from dismissive to downright hostile. The taller one actually scoffed and said to his buddy, loud enough for me to hear, "Someone's been Googling." They both chuckled, and the shorter one added, "Listen, lady, just because you read something on the internet doesn't mean you understand how these things work." I mentioned my background in residential construction, thinking maybe they'd take me more seriously. Big mistake. That just made them more defensive. They started talking over me, using unnecessarily technical terms, which I understood perfectly well, clearly trying to confuse and intimidate me. "Ma'am, the subterranean access point's location mapping is the responsibility of the property owner according to municipal code," the tall one started, but I cut him off. "You mean the buffalo box that's clearly marked on the city's utility maps?" I asked sweetly. Their faces reddened, and they quickly made their excuses to leave. As they walked away, I heard one mutter something about these suburban housewives watching too much HGTV. That night, as I was paying bills and fuming about the encounter, I had an idea, a deliciously petty idea that would require patience and careful planning. I looked at our water bill, then at my father-in-law's meticulous records of his attempts to get the buffalo box located over the years. A plan started forming in my mind. My husband was skeptical when I explained what I wanted to do. "You really want to go up against the city water department?" he asked, watching me create a new spreadsheet to document everything. But I could see the same frustration in his eyes that I'd seen in his father's. The frustration of dealing with this problem for so long, of being dismissed and overcharged because of one missing valve. Looking at my freshly created spreadsheet, I decided to document everything meticulously. My years in construction had taught me that paper trails were worth their weight in gold. I dug out every piece of correspondence my father-in-law had about the buffalo box, including quotes from plumbers dating back to the early 90s. Each one mentioned the same issue: can't locate city shutoff, need expensive pipe freezing process. I started making calls to the water department, requesting all records related to our property. The clerk on the phone seemed confused by my detailed questions about installation dates and maintenance records. "Ma'am, are you a lawyer?" she asked nervously. I just smiled to myself and said I was a homeowner doing my due diligence. When the records arrived, they confirmed what I'd suspected. The original plans showed the buffalo box's installation during the home's construction in the 50s. The city had documentation of its existence, but no records of any maintenance or accessibility issues. This was gold. Then came the part that made my husband nervous. I stopped paying the water bill. Not because we couldn't afford it. I set aside the money each month in a separate account, but because I knew the city had no way to enforce payment without being able to shut off our water. The first late notice came about 6 weeks later. I filed it away. The second one arrived with threats of service disconnection. I called their bluff, writing back a perfectly polite letter requesting they schedule the shutoff at their convenience. No response. My husband started getting anxious. Around month 3. "What if they put a lien on the house?" he asked one night while I was updating my spreadsheet with the latest notice. I showed him the state regulations I'd found. They'd need to provide proof they could actually disconnect service first. He wasn't entirely convinced, but he trusted my research. The letters kept coming, each more strongly worded than the last. I documented every single one, noting dates, threats made, and the increasing urgency of their tone. Meanwhile, I kept gathering evidence. I took photos of every plumber's visit, documented their conclusions about the missing buffalo box, and recorded all interactions with city officials. My father-in-law thought I was crazy at first, but after a few months, he started getting invested in my crusade. He'd stop by with old photos of the yard from when they first built the house, pointing out where utilities had been installed. "You know," he said one afternoon, showing me a faded Polaroid from 1954. "I always knew that box had to be under the sidewalk. They poured new concrete right after the utilities went in. Around month 6, things got interesting. The city tried a new tactic, sending someone from their customer resolution team to our door. I invited her in, offered coffee, and calmly explained the situation. She was actually pretty sympathetic, especially after I showed her my documentation. "This is quite thorough," she said, flipping through my binder, "but surely there's a better way to resolve this than withholding payment." I explained that I'd tried the better way, following proper channels, making reasonable requests, offering to pay for legitimate services. All I got was condescension and dismissal, I told her. Sometimes you have to speak a language people understand. In this case, that language is money. She left with copies of my documentation, promising to escalate the issue. I added her visit to my spreadsheet, not really expecting anything to come of it, but something about her demeanor told me the wheels were starting to turn. During this time, our neighbors started noticing the occasional city truck driving by, workers looking confused as they surveyed our yard from the street. Mrs. Johnson next door, who'd lived in the neighborhood even longer than my in-laws, found it hilarious. "In all my years," she said over the fence one day, "I've never seen them so stumped." The holidays came and went. My spreadsheet grew. The amount in the separate account for the eventual water bill payment increased. My husband had gone from skeptical to quietly supportive, especially after another plumber quoted us $8,000 for the pipe freezing process. "You know," he said one evening, "Dad tried to deal with this for 20 years the nice way. Maybe it's time for something different." I was in the middle of writing yet another response to their latest threatening letter when my phone rang. The caller ID showed city manager's office, and I felt my heart skip a beat. This was either going to be the breakthrough I'd been waiting for, or things were about to get much more complicated. I took a deep breath and answered the phone with my most professional voice. "Hello, this is Rachel. Mrs. Mitchell? This is Robert Henderson, city manager. I'm calling about your unusual situation with the water department." His tone was a mixture of confusion and irritation, exactly what I'd been hoping for. "Yes, Mr. Henderson. I've been expecting someone from the city to call, though I admit I didn't think it would take quite this long." I kept my voice pleasant but firm, already reaching for my binder of documentation. "Well, Mrs. Mitchell, perhaps you could explain why you haven't paid your water bill in nearly 12 months? He sounded like he was trying to intimidate me, but I'd been preparing for this conversation for almost a year. "Of course, Mr. Henderson. I'd be happy to pay my bill, just as soon as the city can turn off my water." The silence on the other end of the line was delicious. I could practically hear him processing what I'd just said. "I'm sorry, you want us to turn off your water? That's correct. In fact, I've been requesting it for months. Your department seems to be having some difficulty locating the shutoff valve that the city installed and is responsible for maintaining. I have all the documentation right here, including the original installation records from 1954. There was another long pause. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from authoritative to cautious. "I've been reviewing some concerning reports about this situation. Perhaps you could fill me in on exactly what's been happening." So I did. I walked him through everything, from my father-in-law's decades-long struggle to the condescending treatment I'd received from his workers. I detailed every interaction, every failed attempt to resolve the issue through proper channels, and every dismissive response I'd documented. "And you see, Mr. Henderson," I continued, warming to my subject, "since your department insists they can't locate their own equipment, and furthermore tried to make this my responsibility despite clear municipal code stating otherwise, I've been conducting a little experiment. If you can't turn off my water, how exactly do you plan to enforce payment?" I heard him let out a long breath. "Mrs. Mitchell, you understand this is highly irregular." "Oh, I agree completely. Almost as irregular as city workers telling a homeowner to dig up a city sidewalk at their own expense to locate city equipment that the city is required by law to maintain. Would you like me to email you the relevant municipal codes?" "I have," Them right here. That won't be necessary. He was silent for a moment. Those workers who came out to your property, would you be able to identify them? Oh, yes, I replied, flipping through my notes. In fact, I have their names, badge, numbers, and exact quotes from our interaction right here. Would you like to hear what they said about women not understanding these types of things? I heard what sounded suspiciously like a suppressed groan. Mrs. Mitchell, I want to personally assure you that this situation will be addressed immediately. Would you be available tomorrow morning? I'll clear my schedule, I said sweetly. Oh, and Mr. Henderson, I've been setting aside the money for the water bill every month. I'm perfectly happy to pay it, once your department demonstrates they can actually locate and maintain their own equipment. After hanging up, I sat back in my chair, heart pounding. My husband found me there a few minutes later, staring at the phone with what must have been a slightly maniacal grin. Everything okay? He asked cautiously. Oh yes, I replied, already pulling out a fresh page in my documentation binder. Everything's perfect. We're going to have some visitors tomorrow. That night, I barely slept. I kept running through scenarios in my head, preparing responses for every possible outcome. What if they tried to fine us? What if they threatened legal action? What if they just flat out refused to help? But underneath all the anxiety was a current of pure anticipation. Finally, after all these months of careful documentation and strategic patience, something was going to happen. I got up early the next morning and made coffee, setting up my home office with every piece of documentation clearly visible. I had a feeling the city manager wasn't going to be the only one showing up, and I wanted to be ready. Just before 8 a.m., I heard the distinctive rumble of heavy equipment coming down our street. I looked out my front window to see a small excavator rolling up to the curb, followed by 2 familiar city trucks. My old friends from the water department stepped out, looking significantly less cocky than during our last encounter. They were joined by a man in a crisp, button-down shirt who I assumed was Mr. Henderson. My assumption was correct. As they approached the front door, Mr. Henderson introduced himself with a firm handshake and an apologetic smile. The 2 workers stood behind him, studying their boots with intense fascination. Mrs. Mitchell, I've reviewed your documentation and the original property plans. We believe the Buffalo box is likely under the sidewalk section that was replaced in 1954. He gestured to the workers. The team is here to locate and restore access to the valve. I noticed he emphasized the word team while glancing pointedly at the 2 workers, who somehow managed to find even more interesting things to look at on their boots. Wonderful, I said, matching his professional tone. Would you like to see the photos my father-in-law took during the original installation? They might help narrow down the location. The taller worker's head snapped up. I saw a flash of surprise cross his face. Clearly, he hadn't expected this level of documentation. Mr. Henderson accepted the photos with interest, and for the next few minutes, we all studied them while standing in my front yard. The workers actually had some useful input once they got over their initial discomfort, pointing out likely utility patterns based on the era of construction. Then, the digging began. I brought out coffee and water. Kill them with kindness, right? And settled into a lawn chair to watch the show. My father-in-law showed up around mid-morning, carrying a cooler of sandwiches. Thought I'd stop by and see if they found my nemesis yet, he said with a grin, setting up his own chair next to mine. The workers were thorough this time, methodically working their way along the sidewalk. Around noon, the shorter one's shovel hit something metallic. Found it! He called out, and everyone gathered around the hole. There it was, the mysterious Buffalo box, buried under decades of concrete and dirt, exactly where the original photos had suggested it would be. The workers looked simultaneously relieved and chagrined. Mr. Henderson turned to me. Mrs. Mitchell, I want to personally apologize for the way this situation was handled. This should have been resolved during your first call to our department. I nodded graciously. I appreciate that, Mr. Henderson, though I think there might be 2 other people who also have something to say. The workers shifted uncomfortably before the taller one cleared his throat. Ma'am, we were wrong, both about the location being your responsibility and other things we said. It won't happen again. His partner nodded vigorously. We've been properly reminded about city maintenance responsibilities and, professional conduct standards. I had to bite back a smile at their carefully worded apology. Someone had clearly coached them on what to say. Still, they seemed genuinely embarrassed, especially when my father-in-law launched into the story of his 20-year quest to find the Buffalo box. The rest of the day was surprisingly pleasant. The workers were professional and efficient as they cleared the access point and installed a proper cover. They even helped my father-in-law document the exact location and depth for future reference. By late afternoon, we had a fully functional, accessible water shutoff valve. As they packed up their equipment, Mr. Henderson handed me his business card. Please call my office directly tomorrow to arrange payment for your outstanding water bill. And Mrs. Mitchell, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know if you have any future issues with our department. After they left, my father-in-law and I sat in the yard looking at the fresh concrete patch in the sidewalk. You know, he said thoughtfully. In all my years dealing with city bureaucracy, I've never seen anything quite like this. I smiled, thinking about my next project. The interior shutoff valve still needed to be installed, but now we could do it properly. More importantly, I'd proven something to myself. Sometimes the best revenge isn't a dramatic confrontation. It's having the patience to let people dig their own holes. Literally, in this case. The next morning, I called Mr. Henderson's office to settle our water bill. His secretary immediately knew who I was. Apparently, I'd become something of a legend in the department. She transferred me straight through to him. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said warmly, "I've been reviewing our procedures in light of your situation. Would you believe you're not the first person to have issues locating their Buffalo box?" I wasn't surprised. If they'd given me this much trouble, how many other homeowners had they dismissed? How many had paid thousands for pipe freezing because the city wouldn't do its job? The conversation took an unexpected turn when he asked if I'd be willing to share my documentation process. "Your organizational system was impressive," he admitted. "We're implementing new training procedures, and your case would make an excellent example." I agreed on one condition, that they create a proper database of Buffalo box locations and maintenance records. He readily agreed. I had a feeling my little standoff had caused quite a stir in the department. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Mrs. Johnson next door was the first to stop by, coffee in hand and curiosity written all over her face. "So it's true?" she asked, settling into my kitchen chair. "You got them to dig up their own sidewalk?" I showed her my documentation binder, and her eyes widened. "My sister's been fighting with them about her water pressure for months," she said thoughtfully. "Mind if I borrow some of these blank forms?" Over the next few weeks, something interesting started happening. Neighbors began stopping by, each with their own utility horror stories. I found myself giving impromptu lessons in document organization and municipal code citations. My dining room table became command central for a growing resistance movement of informed homeowners. Tom from 3 doors down used my system to finally get the city to admit they'd mismapped his gas line. The Petersons across the street successfully challenged an incorrect meter reading that had doubled their bill. Even my father-in-law got in on the action, helping elderly Mrs. Garcia document her ongoing battle with the telecommunications company about improperly installed cables. The water department workers became regular faces in our neighborhood, but their attitude had completely changed. They were professional, thorough, and, most notably, respectful to everyone, regardless of gender or age. Word got around that the crazy lady with the binder had somehow transformed them from dismissive jerks into actual public servants. My husband found it all highly amusing. "You've created a monster," he said one evening, watching me help our neighbor Sarah organize her documents for a zoning dispute. "The city's going to start banning office supplies if this keeps up." But the real validation came about 2 months after the Buffalo box incident. I was working in my home office when I noticed a city truck pull up outside Mrs. Johnson's house. Through my window, I watched the same 2 workers who had dismissed me all those months ago carefully explaining something to her, pointing at various spots in her yard and taking notes. Later, Mrs. Johnson came over bubbling with excitement. "You'll never believe this," she said. "They came to do a routine check and found my water pressure issues were caused by a degraded connection on their side of the meter. They're fixing it next week, no charge." I smiled, thinking about the larger impact of my small act of resistance. It wasn't just about winning a battle with bureaucracy anymore. Something bigger was happening. In our community, people were learning to stand up for themselves, to document everything, to know their rights. That evening, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Sarah, our neighbor dealing with the zoning dispute. "Rachel," she said, her voice trembling with excitement, "you're not going to believe what just happened at the city council meeting." I grabbed my notebook, already intrigued. Sarah had been fighting a ridiculous zoning violation notice about her garden shed for weeks. "What happened at the meeting? You know how you taught me to document everything and take photos?" Sarah was practically shouting into the phone. "Well, I presented my evidence to the council, just like you showed me. But here's the crazy part. I wasn't the only one there with a binder. Apparently, word of the binder method had spread beyond our immediate neighborhood. The city council meeting had turned into something of a revolution. 5 different residents had shown up, each armed with meticulously organized documentation of various municipal issues. The council members' faces when everyone started pulling out their binders. "Priceless," Sarah laughed. One of them actually said, "Oh no, not another one." I couldn't help but grin. My small act of rebellion had sparked something bigger than I'd ever imagined. But Sarah wasn't finished. "That's not even the best part," she continued. "Remember those water department workers who gave you trouble? Turns out they've been complaining about understaffing and outdated record-keeping systems for years, but nobody listened. Your Buffalo box situation finally forced the department to address it. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I drove down to City Hall and requested the minutes from the council meeting. The clerk who helped me had a knowing look in her eye. "Ah, you must be the binder lady," she said, handing me the documents. You've certainly made my job more interesting lately. Reading through the minutes, I was amazed. The council had voted to allocate funds for a digital documentation system for utility locations. They were also reviewing their citizen complaint procedures and establishing a new position for a community liaison officer. But the real surprise came when I got home. There was a message on my answering machine from a local news reporter. She wanted to do a story about how one resident's stand against bureaucratic dismissal had sparked a community-wide movement for better municipal accountability. My husband found me staring at the answering machine. "You okay?" he asked. "I just wanted them to find a water valve," I said weakly. "How did this turn into a news story?" He laughed. "Because you didn't just find a valve. You gave people a blueprint for standing up for themselves." Speaking of which, he handed me a piece of mail that had arrived that day. It was a letter from the city manager's office. Inside was an invitation to join a newly formed Citizens Advisory Committee for Municipal Services. They wanted me to help develop new procedures for handling resident complaints and maintaining utility records. I sat down at my dining room table, now permanently covered in neighbors' documents and cases, and thought about how far this had come from my original petty revenge plan. Mrs. Johnson was hosting weekly documentation parties where neighbors helped each other organize their records. The water department workers had become unexpected allies in improving the system. Even my father-in-law was getting in on the action, using his decades of home maintenance records to help create a historical database of utility work in the neighborhood. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Emergency meeting at my house tonight. You're not going to believe what the building inspector just told me about the city's record-keeping system." I grabbed my binder and car keys. Whatever was coming next, I had a feeling it was going to be interesting. The small act of standing up to 2 dismissive workers had somehow turned into a full-blown community movement, and I was apparently now its reluctant leader. As I backed out of my driveway, I noticed the water department truck down the street. The workers waved as they finished up installing a new Buffalo box marker for the Hendersons. It wasn't lost on me that just a few months ago, they would have claimed such a task was the homeowner's responsibility. I pulled up to Sarah's house to find several cars already parked outside. This wasn't just another documentation party. Something big was happening. Inside, I found our usual group of neighbors, plus a man I didn't recognize who Sarah quickly introduced as Mike, the city's building inspector. Mike looked nervous, constantly adjusting his tie as he glanced around Sarah's living room at our expectant faces. "Look," he began, "what I'm about to tell you isn't exactly secret, but it's not something we advertise either." He pulled out a laptop and opened a file. "This is our current system for tracking utility installations, repairs, and citizen complaints." The screen showed a mess of spreadsheets, some dating back to the 1980s, with obvious gaps and inconsistencies. "Every department has their own way of keeping records," he explained. "Water uses one system, gas another, building permits a third. Nothing talks to each other. Half our older records were never digitized properly. And this," he clicked through several folders. "This is why finding your Buffalo box was such a nightmare." The folder was labeled pre-1960 installations and contained thousands of unlabeled scanned documents. My father-in-law leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Is that my original building permit?" Mike nodded. "Probably. Along with every other permit, inspection, and utility installation from that era. All scanned, no organization, no searchable text. Finding specific information is basically impossible unless you know exactly where to look." Mrs. Johnson raised her hand like we were in a classroom. "So, when we call about problems, the person answering has no way to access the full history," Mike finished. "They can see recent complaints, but anything older than 5 years might as well not exist. Those workers who came to your house," he looked at me, "they literally had no way to know about your father-in-law's previous attempts to locate the valve." A murmur went through the room. All those dismissive responses, all that runaround. It wasn't just bureaucratic laziness. The system itself was broken. "Why are you showing us this?" Tom asked from his corner. Mike straightened his tie again. "Because next week, the city council is voting on a budget proposal. One option is to put money into a new integrated digital system that would fix these problems. The other is to continue patching the old system and hope it holds together." "Let me guess," I said. "You're not supposed to be telling us this." He smiled weakly. "Let's just say I'm providing information to concerned citizens. What you do with it is up to you." The room erupted in planning mode. Sarah started organizing people into groups. Mrs. Johnson was already on her phone, calling everyone she knew who might attend the council meeting. Tom and my father-in-law huddled over the laptop with Mike, identifying specific examples of how the broken system had affected real people. I sat back, watching the controlled chaos. This had evolved so far beyond my original petty revenge. We weren't just fighting individual battles anymore. We were pushing for systemic change. My phone buzzed. A text from Mr. Henderson. "Heard your group found out about the system vote. My hands are tied officially, but if someone were to request the maintenance cost records for the last 5 years, They might find some interesting numbers to present at the meeting. I smiled, remembering how this all started with one missing water valve and 2 dismissive workers. Now here we were, with allies inside the system, organizing a campaign to modernize the entire city's infrastructure management. As I watched my neighbors planning their council meeting strategy, another text came through. This one was from the local reporter who'd contacted me earlier. Sources say Tuesday's council meeting might get interesting. Care to comment on the record about your experiences with city record keeping? Sarah caught my eye from across the room, where she was explaining our documentation system to some newcomers. She gave me a thumbs up and mouthed, "Your move, binder lady." I looked around at my neighbors, all busy preparing for the biggest challenge yet to the old way of doing things. The city council had no idea what was coming. After all, they'd never faced a room full of people armed with color-coded binders and righteous indignation. The city council chamber was packed Tuesday night. I'd never seen anything like it. Every seat filled, people standing along the walls, and each person clutching a binder or folder. The council members' faces as they walked in were priceless. One actually stopped short in the doorway, causing a minor pileup of officials behind him. Mr. Henderson was there, sitting quietly in the back. He gave me a subtle nod as I walked past. The 2 water department workers who'd started this whole thing were also present, looking both uncomfortable and oddly supportive. Mike, the building inspector, had provided us with enough ammunition to start a revolution. The maintenance costs for the old system were astronomical. The time wasted searching for records averaged 3.5 hours per request. The number of incorrect citations due to bad record keeping was shocking. We had it all documented, color-coded, and ready to present. When public comment opened, we were ready. Mrs. Johnson led the charge, presenting a detailed analysis of how much money the city had wasted sending workers on wild goose chases for missing records. Tom followed with specific examples of safety issues caused by incorrect utility mapping. My father-in-law, now our resident historian, showed how the problem had grown worse over decades of neglect. The council members started looking increasingly uncomfortable as speaker after speaker approached the podium, each armed with meticulously documented evidence. The city attorney was frantically taking notes. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium, my original Buffalo box binder in hand. "Good evening," I began. "You might know me as the woman who refused to pay her water bill for a year." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. "But I'm not here to talk about water bills or Buffalo boxes. I'm here to talk about respect." I opened my binder. "When citizens come to you with problems, we're not just complaining. We're trying to work with you to maintain our community, but your broken system makes that impossible. It forces your workers to dismiss valid concerns because they can't access the information they need. It wastes everyone's time and money. And worst of all, it erodes trust between citizens and their government." I gestured to the crowd. "Look around. Every person here has a story about how your outdated systems have affected their lives. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for functional, modern record keeping that serves everyone's interests, including yours." The vote wasn't even close. The council approved the budget for the new system unanimously. As people filed out of the chamber, I overheard one council member say to another, "I haven't seen organization like this since the pickle factory zoning dispute of '86. The local paper ran a story the next day. Citizen-led initiative prompts municipal modernization. There was a photo of all of us with our binders, looking like some kind of suburban resistance movement, which I suppose we were. In the months that followed, things changed dramatically. The new system was implemented, with input from a citizen advisory committee. Yes, I ended up joining. The water department workers who'd once dismissed me became vocal advocates for better record keeping. They even asked me to help train new employees on citizen relations. My father-in-law finally got his interior shutoff valve installed properly, with all records digitally logged and accessible. He framed the work order and hung it next to his favorite family photos. Mrs. Johnson's weekly documentation parties evolved into a community advocacy group. We help people navigate city services, maintain records, and stand up for themselves effectively. The binders are optional now, but most people still use them. They've become something of a symbol. Last week, I got a call from a neighboring town's community organization. They'd heard about our success and wanted advice on implementing something similar. Looking back, it's amazing how one missing water valve and 2 dismissive workers led to all this. My original plan was just to prove a point about respecting homeowners regardless of their gender. Instead, we ended up changing the entire system. The other day, I ran into one of those original water department workers at the grocery store. He actually thanked me. "You know," he said, "that Buffalo box situation was the best thing that could have happened to our department. Now we can actually help people instead of making excuses." I still keep the original binder on my shelf. Sometimes, when I look at it, I think about how the most effective revenge isn't about getting even. It's about making things better. Not just for yourself, but for everyone. Even the city manager admitted it during our last advisory committee meeting. Sometimes it takes one person willing to stand their ground to show us where the real problems are. I couldn't help but add, especially if that person has a binder.